She was 7. All she'd wanted was a doll from the store window. But on the way there, she saw an old horse about to be loaded onto a slaughter truck, and without a word, she handed over every single birthday coin to save him. Everyone told her she had wasted her money on a dying animal. 1 year later, that horse did something that left the entire town speechless. Her name was Maya, and she lived in a small town in eastern Kentucky where everyone knew everyone and no one had much to spare. The horse she saved was a 22-year-old chestnut gelding named Copper, bound for a slaughterhouse in Mexico. What Maya didn't know that day, what no one at that auction could have possibly predicted, was that Copper wasn't just another broken-down animal at the end of his road. He was carrying a secret that would rewrite everything. Maya lived with her parents in a faded white house at the edge of town, where the porch sagged just enough to make visitors nervous, and the garden had long since surrendered to weeds. Her father, Tom, worked double shifts at the auto parts plant 2 counties over, and her mother, Lena, took in sewing from neighbors to keep the lights on. Birthdays in their home were small affairs. A handmade cake, a single gift if the month had been kind. That year, Maya had asked for a doll with real hair and a dress that matched the one she'd seen in the store window on Main Street. She had saved every dollar her grandmother sent, every quarter she found in parking lots, until she had $28 in a small glass jar beside her bed. On the morning of her 7th birthday, she poured the coins into a cloth pouch and asked her mother to take her to the store. But they never made it to Main Street. Just past the railroad tracks, Lena had to slow the car. The county livestock auction was in full swing, and the road was clogged with trailers and pickup trucks hauling animals of every size. Maya pressed her face to the window, watching the parade of cattle and goats and horses being led through the gates. That was when she saw him. A chestnut gelding, so thin his ribs cast shadows, his head hanging low as a man in a stained baseball cap tugged him toward a holding pen marked with a single word on a handwritten sign: slaughter. Maya did not understand the word, but she understood the look in the horse's eyes. It was the same look her father had when he came home after a bad shift, hollow and far away. She asked her mother to stop the car, and before anyone could argue, she was running toward the pen, her little shoes kicking up dust. The auction worker barely glanced at her. He was busy arguing with a kill buyer from Texas who had already bid $300 for the horse. Maya tugged on his sleeve. When he finally looked down, she held up her cloth pouch and said, "I have $28. Can I buy him instead?" The men laughed. The kill buyer told her to run along, but Lena had followed her daughter, and when she saw the horse, something in her own tired heart flickered. She made a phone call to Tom, who left work early and arrived 40 minutes later with a horse trailer borrowed from a neighbor and a check for $200 to cover the difference. Together, they outbid the kill buyer by $5. Copper was theirs. The first week was brutal. Copper had been starved for months, his hooves cracked, his coat matted with burrs and filth. The local vet, an older woman named Dr. Harmon who had treated every animal in the county for 3 decades, shook her head when she saw him. "He's at least 22 years old," she said, running her hands over his protruding spine. "And he's been through something terrible. You can see it in the way he flinches at sudden movements." She gave them a feeding schedule and a list of supplements that would cost more than they could afford, but she also slipped Tom a bottle of vitamins from her own supply and refused to take payment for the visit. Maya spent every waking hour at Copper's side. She sat on a bucket near his stall, singing songs she'd learned in kindergarten, telling him about the doll she hadn't bought and why she didn't care anymore. At first, Copper ignored her completely. He stood in the corner with his back to the door, his ears pinned flat, his body rigid with the memory of every hand that had struck him. But by the 3rd day, something shifted. When Maya arrived with a handful of carrots, Copper turned his head. By the 5th day, he nickered when he heard her footsteps on the gravel. By the end of the 2nd week, he would not let her out of his sight. It was Lena who noticed the strange behavior first. Copper had begun pressing his large head against Maya's chest whenever she stood still for too long. He would lower his muzzle to her small ribcage and hold it there, breathing deeply, his eyes half closed as if listening to something only he could hear. At first, everyone assumed it was affection, but then he started doing something more unsettling. Whenever Maya ran too fast or played too hard, Copper would plant himself directly in her path, refusing to move until she sat down and rested. Once he even nudged her so firmly she tumbled onto the grass, then stood over her like a shield until her breathing slowed. The first time it happened for real, it was a Tuesday afternoon in late September. Maya was helping her mother hang laundry in the yard, running back and forth with clothespins in her small hands. Copper was in the pasture, but the moment she stumbled, just a brief wobble, a hand pressed to her head, he was at the fence, ears flat, packing with an urgency that made Lena's blood run cold. Before Lena could reach her daughter, Maya's eyes rolled back and she crumpled onto the grass. Copper screamed. Not a whinny, not a neigh, a raw, desperate scream that brought neighbors running from 3 houses down. By the time Tom got home, Maya was conscious again, confused and tired, but alive. The doctor at the urgent care clinic said it was probably dehydration, maybe low blood sugar. Nothing to worry about, go home and rest. But Copper would not calm down. He paced the fence line for hours, his gaze fixed on the house, and Lena, sitting beside her daughter's bed, could not shake the feeling that the horse knew something they did not. So she called Dr. Harmon and described everything, the pressing against Maya's chest, the blocking, the scream. Dr. Harmon was silent for a long moment. Then she asked a question no one expected. Does Copper have a microchip? The next morning, Dr. Harmon arrived with a scanner and ran it along Copper's neck. The device beeped immediately. A number appeared on the screen, and Dr. Harmon wrote it down with a hand that trembled slightly. She made a phone call from her truck, and when she returned, her face was pale. Copper was not just an old horse rescued from a slaughter pipeline. He was a registered medical alert horse, trained by a specialized facility 3 states away. He had been reported stolen from a therapy program for children with undiagnosed cardiac conditions nearly 2 years earlier. The facility had never found him, and the specific condition he was trained to detect, the one he had been alerting to in Maya for weeks, was a rare heart arrhythmia that could cause sudden cardiac arrest in children without any prior symptoms. Maya's fainting spell had not been dehydration, and Copper had not been trying to show affection. He had been trying to save her life. Dr. Harmon did not wait for permission. She called a pediatric cardiologist at the Children's Hospital in Lexington that same afternoon and described the horse's behavior with the kind of clinical precision that only 30 years of veterinary practice could provide. To her credit, the cardiologist did not laugh. Her name was Dr. Elaine Okonkwo, and she had spent the last 15 years studying sudden cardiac death in children. She had heard stranger things than a horse detecting an arrhythmia. She had read the literature on medical alert dogs, had even consulted on a case in Ohio where a family cat had begun sleeping on a child's chest 3 days before a previously undetected heart defect was discovered. Animals, she knew, could sense things that machines could not. So she told Dr. Harmon to send the family immediately, and she cleared her entire afternoon. Tom and Lena sat in the examination room while a team of specialists ran tests on their daughter. Echocardiograms, electrocardiograms, blood work, genetic panels. Maya, for her part, was more concerned about whether Copper was lonely in his stall than about the wires attached to her small chest. She asked Dr. Okonkwo if she had any carrots in her office, because Copper really liked carrots, and he had been so brave when they left him at the farm. Dr. Okonkwo, a woman known throughout the hospital for her unflappable composure, found herself blinking back tears. The results took 3 days to come back, but Dr. Okonkwo knew what she was looking for before the lab confirmed it. Maya had a rare genetic condition called catecholaminergic polymorphic ventricular tachycardia, CPVT for short. It was a disorder that affected the heart's electrical system, causing it to go into fatal arrhythmias during moments of stress or excitement. Children with CPVT often appeared perfectly healthy until the day they collapsed and never got up. The condition was so rare that most pediatricians never encountered a case in their entire careers, and so lethal that the first symptom was frequently death. Maya had been living with a ticking bomb inside her chest, and no one had known. No one except an old chestnut gelding who had been trained to smell the chemical changes that preceded an episode. The next revelation came from the microchip in Copper's neck. The registration number traced back to a facility called Shepherd's Rest Equine Therapy Center, located near Asheville, North Carolina. The director, a woman named Angela Foster, answered Dr. Harmon's call on the third ring and listened in stunned silence as the veterinarian explained where her horse had been found. Copper, whose registered name was actually Copperfield Guardian, had been one of their most valuable assets. He had been trained over 18 months to detect the scent of catecholamine surges in human sweat and saliva, a skill that only a handful of horses in the world had ever been taught. He had been placed with 3 different children before his theft, and each time his alerts had led to life-saving interventions. Then, on a transport run in the fall of 2 years prior, the trailer carrying him and 2 other horses had been stolen from a motel parking lot off Interstate 75. The police had found the trailer abandoned 2 weeks later near a livestock auction in Tennessee, but the horses were gone. Angela had never stopped searching. She had posted in every horse forum, called every auction house in the Southeast, and spent thousands of dollars on private investigators who all came back with nothing. She had eventually been forced to accept that Copper was dead, that his training and his gentleness had been wasted in a kill pen somewhere across the border. When Dr. Harmon told her that he was not only alive, but had just identified an undiagnosed cardiac condition in a 7-year-old girl, Angela wept openly on the phone. But the joy of the discovery was quickly tempered by a harsh reality. Copper was Shepherd's Rest property. The theft had been documented in police reports and insurance claims. Legally, there was no gray area. Angela did not want to take him away from a child whose life he was actively saving, but the therapy center's board of directors had a fiduciary duty to recover stolen assets, and Copper, with his rare and expensive training, was worth more than $100,000 on the open market. The family had paid $28 in coins and a $200 check. They had no receipt, no bill of sale that would hold up in court. They had nothing but the horse himself, and the horse, in the eyes of the law, did not belong to them. Lena received this news in the hospital cafeteria while Maya was undergoing her final round of tests. She listened to the lawyer's voice on the phone, explaining the situation in careful, sympathetic tones that did nothing to soften the blow. When she hung up, she did not cry. She walked back to the waiting room, sat down beside Tom, and told him everything. Tom, a man who had spent his entire adult life solving problems with his hands, had no answer for this one. He could not fix a legal claim. He could not outwork a board of directors. He could not build something that would make copper theirs. The story might have ended there, quietly and unfairly, if not for a nurse named Delia who had been monitoring Maya during her stress test. Delia had overheard the parents talking in the hallway, and she had gone home that night and told her husband, who told his brother, who happened to edit the local newspaper. The next morning, a reporter named Caleb Frost showed up at the farm. He was young, barely out of college, and he had been assigned to cover school board meetings and county fair results. But when he saw Copper standing in the pasture with his head resting protectively over Maya's small shoulder, he understood that he had stumbled into something far bigger than a human interest piece. He took photographs. He interviewed the neighbors who had heard Copper scream. He called Dr. Harmon, who gave him the medical timeline and the microchip information with the family's permission. He called Dr. Okonkwo, who explained CPVT in terms a layperson could understand, emphasizing that without Copper's alerts, Maya would almost certainly not have survived the year. And he called Shepherd's Rest, where Angela Foster broke down on the record and confessed that she could not sleep at night knowing her organization was legally obligated to separate a dying child from the animal saving her life. The article ran on a Thursday. By Friday morning, the story had been picked up by regional television stations. By Friday evening, a GoFundMe page created by a stranger in Louisville had raised more than $40,000, not to buy Copper, but to secure the very best medical care for Maya and to apply legal pressure on the therapy center's board. The public response was ferocious. People who had never met the family wrote letters to the editor, called the center's offices, and offered to fund the full replacement cost of Copper's training if Shepherd's Rest would simply let him stay. The board met in an emergency session on Saturday. Angela argued passionately for an unprecedented exception, citing the ethical obligations of their mission statement and the public relations disaster that would follow if they pursued a legal claim. 2 board members sided with her. 3 abstained. The vote deadlocked, and the decision was postponed for another week, leaving the family in agonizing limbo. But while the adults fought over ownership and legalities, Copper continued doing the only thing he knew how to do. He kept watching Maya, and what he sensed over the next 48 hours would change everything. On Sunday morning, 2 days before Maya was scheduled for a procedure to implant a cardiac monitor, Copper began acting differently. His usual alerts had been gentle nudges and the pressing of his head against her chest. Now he refused to let her out of the stall. He stood between her and the door, his body a solid wall of muscle, and when Lena tried to lead him away, he planted his hooves and would not move. He had never behaved this way before. Lena felt a cold dread settle into her stomach. She called Dr. Harmon, who came immediately, bringing a portable monitor that could measure Maya's heart rate in real time. The reading was normal. Copper continued to block the door. Dr. Harmon called Dr. Okonkwo and held the phone up to Copper's breathing. Dr. Okonkwo listened, then asked Lena to describe exactly what the horse was doing. When Lena finished, there was a long pause on the line. Then Dr. Okonkwo said something that made the blood drain from Lena's face. The worst episodes in CPVT patients don't always show on a resting monitor. They build silently over hours or even days. If Copper is this insistent, if he's refusing to let her move, he may be sensing a buildup that we can't detect yet. Get her to the hospital. Now, do not wait for an ambulance. Drive her yourself and drive fast. Lena grabbed Maya from the stall, and Copper finally stepped aside, but only after pressing his muzzle against the girl's chest one last time. His eyes were wild with something that looked terrifyingly like fear. Tom had the truck running before the barn door was fully open. They raced toward Lexington at a speed that earned them a police escort after a state trooper saw Tom's hazard lights flashing and Lena's desperate wave from the passenger seat. Maya in the back seat was conscious and confused, asking why everyone was so scared. They were 12 minutes from the hospital when Maya's eyes fluttered, her head tilted back against the seat. The color left her lips. Lena screamed her name, and in the front seat, Tom pressed the accelerator to the floor, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his heart pounding a rhythm he was certain would be his last if his daughters stopped. What happened next was not a miracle, but it felt like one. The trooper ahead of them, hearing Lena's screams over the radio, cleared the highway all the way to the hospital entrance. A trauma team was waiting at the curb when the truck skidded to a stop. Maya was unconscious when they pulled her from the back seat, and her heart was beating in a pattern so chaotic that the emergency room doctor later described it as a fibrillation that should have been fatal within 90 seconds. They defibrillated her in the elevator. They restarted her heart on the 6th floor, and when Dr. Okonkwo finally emerged from the intensive care unit, her face was unreadable. She walked straight to Tom and Lena and said 5 words that shattered everything they thought they knew. "She has the rarest form." Dr. Okonkwo said the words quietly, her voice stripped of the clinical detachment she had maintained through every previous conversation. Maya's variant of CPVT, she explained, was a subtype so aggressive that it resisted standard beta-blocker therapy. The medication that kept most children stable would not work for her. She needed a surgical procedure called a left cardiac sympathetic denervation, a delicate operation that involved cutting into the nerves of the chest to interrupt the deadly electrical signals that triggered arrhythmias. Without it, the next episode would almost certainly be her last. But the surgery itself carried a 15% mortality risk in children her age, and the only surgeon in the region who performed it was based in Cleveland, a 6-hour drive from their home, and booked solid for the next 4 months. Tom stood in the hallway with his back against the wall, his face gray. Lena asked a question she already knew the answer to: how long could Maya wait? Dr. Okonkwo did not hesitate. "Weeks," she said, "maybe less." The episode that had nearly killed her in the truck had damaged the heart muscle, and the electrical instability was accelerating. Copper had sensed it before any machine could detect the change, and that fact, as much as anything else, had the cardiologist deeply shaken. She had spent her career trusting imaging and blood work and electrophysiology studies. Now she was taking diagnostic cues from a stolen horse in a barn 3 counties away, and she was terrified that if that horse was taken from the family, Maya would die before anyone else learned to read the signs. The legal situation, already precarious, began to unravel faster than anyone anticipated. The Board of Shepherd's Rest had been prepared to deliberate over ethical obligations and insurance liabilities, but a new player entered the picture with no interest in either. The man who had originally outbid the kill buyer by $5, the one who had sold copper to Tom and Lena at the auction, surfaced with a claim of his own. He had been a middleman, a trader who moved horses from auction to auction, and he argued that he had never legally owned copper in the first place. He had purchased him from a man with a handshake deal, no paperwork, no bill of sale. If Shepherd's Rest pursued their ownership claim, the chain of custody would fracture into a legal nightmare that could take years to untangle. And in the meantime, the horse would be impounded as evidence, locked in a holding facility where Maya could not reach him. Caleb Frost, the young reporter, broke the story of the middleman's claim on the front page of the Sunday edition. The headline was brutal and effective. The horse that saved a child may be taken from her by the system meant to protect him. The public, already inflamed by the earlier coverage, erupted with a fury that crashed Shepherd's Rest's phone lines and flooded their social media pages with demands for a resolution. Donations to the GoFundMe surpassed $200,000. A law firm in Louisville offered to represent the family pro bono. A state senator from Myers District called the governor's office to inquire about emergency legislative options. And still, the board did not act. Angela Foster, the director of Shepherd's Rest, stopped sleeping entirely. She spent her nights drafting proposals for a compromise. The therapy center would retain technical ownership of Copper, but would lease him to the family for $1 a year, with full legal protections ensuring he could never be sold or removed without cause. It was a creative solution, but it required board approval, and 2 members remained unyielding. One of them, a retired attorney named Bowers, argued that making an exception for one stolen horse would set a precedent that undermined all future recovery efforts. The other, a donor who had contributed more than $1 million to the center's endowment, simply stated that rules existed for a reason and that emotional appeals should not override them. The deadlock held until Copper did something that no amount of legal argument could refute. On the 3rd day after Maya's hospitalization, Tom collapsed in the barn. He had been cleaning stalls, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while his wife stayed at the hospital, when Copper suddenly went rigid. The horse had been standing quietly in his stall, but the moment Tom's heart began its silent acceleration, Copper threw his weight against the door and screamed with the same raw, desperate sound that had brought neighbors running for Maya. The farm hand, James, called an ambulance. By the time the paramedics arrived, Tom was conscious but drenched in sweat, his pulse racing at 200 beats per minute. At the emergency room, the attending physician ran a standard cardiac panel and found nothing. He was ready to discharge Tom with a diagnosis of anxiety until Dr. Okonkwo, alerted by Lena, called from Lexington and demanded they run the specific genetic panel for CPVT. The results came back positive. Tom had the same condition. He had been living with it for 39 years without knowing, his episodes misdiagnosed as panic attacks and dehydration, and once, during a high school football game, as heat stroke. The same rare variant, the same ticking bomb, and the horse had caught it in a man who showed no outward signs, a man who had simply been going about his morning chores while his electrical system spiraled toward catastrophe. The revelation rewired the entire narrative. The story was no longer about a little girl who had saved a horse and gotten lucky. It was about an animal with a gift so precise and so reliable that he had now identified 2 undiagnosed cases of the same lethal arrhythmia in the same household within a single week. Medical researchers from Johns Hopkins contacted Dr. Okonkwo, asking for data. A cardiology journal requested a case study. Angela Foster, reading the news from her office in North Carolina, realized that Copper's value was not the $100,000 his training represented on a balance sheet. His value was in the lives he was actively saving right now, and every day the board delayed, they risked being responsible for the death of a child or her father. She called Bowers directly, not as an employee addressing a board member, but as a human being pleading with another human being. She told him about the second diagnosis. She told him about the journal inquiries and the research interest, and the fact that Copper was generating more positive publicity for equine-assisted therapy than any marketing campaign she had ever run. And then she told him something that she had not shared with anyone else. The man who had originally stolen copper from the transport trailer had been arrested 6 months earlier on unrelated charges and had confessed during a plea negotiation that he had been paid by someone who wanted copper specifically. The theft had not been random. It had been targeted, commissioned by an individual who understood exactly what copper could do and wanted him removed from the therapy program for reasons that remained unknown. Bowers listened to the entire account. When Angela finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he asked a single question: "Is the family in danger?" Angela did not know how to answer that. She knew only that someone had paid to have copper stolen once before, and that person had never been caught. And now Copper was the most famous horse in the country, his face on every news channel, his location broadcast to anyone who cared to look. If the person who wanted him gone was still out there, they knew exactly where he was, and they knew exactly which child was depending on him to stay alive. The board voted that night. Bowers, the retired attorney, recused himself from the proceedings and instead placed his personal attorney on retainer to draft the lease agreement Angela had proposed. The million-dollar donor, who had insisted that rules existed for a reason, sent a single sentence by email: "I was wrong." By sunrise, Copperfield Guardian was legally bound to Maya's family for the remainder of his natural life, with Shepherd's Rest retaining a custodial interest that existed only on paper. The paperwork arrived at the hospital by courier, and Lena signed it with a shaking hand while Maya slept in the ICU down the hall. But the danger Angela had uncovered did not evaporate with the ink on a contract. The man who had stolen copper 2 years earlier, a career criminal named Ellis Crane, had been arrested for an armed robbery in Georgia and was now facing decades in federal prison. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he had given investigators a detailed confession about the horse theft. He had been hired by a woman named Patricia Voss, a former employee of a competing equine therapy center that had lost a major research grant to Shepherd's Rest. Voss had learned, through industry connections, that Copper was the center's most advanced medical alert horse, and that his success rate in detecting cardiac events was the foundation of their grant application. Eliminating Copper would eliminate their funding advantage. She had paid Crane $20,000 to make the horse disappear. The confession sat in a sealed federal file, unknown to anyone outside the prosecutor's office, until Angela's frantic search for answers after the theft triggered a records request that crossed desks in 2 different states. When the FBI finally connected the dots, Voss had already relocated to Oregon and was operating a small animal-assisted therapy practice of her own. She was arrested on a Tuesday morning, charged with conspiracy to commit interstate theft and animal trafficking. The news broke the same day Maya was transferred to Cleveland for her surgery. Tom was diagnosed and stabilized before they left. His CPVT, caught by Copper before it could kill him, was managed with medication and a defibrillator implanted in his chest. He would never work double shifts again, but he would live to see his daughter grow up. That fact alone, he told reporters, was more than he had ever asked of the universe. The surgery on Maya's heart took 7 hours. Dr. Okonkwo stood in the observation gallery, watching the Cleveland surgeon's hands move through the delicate landscape of nerves and vessels that controlled the rhythm of a child's life. Halfway through, she received a text from Dr. Harmon, who had stayed back at the farm with Copper. "He's calm," the message read, "standing at the fence facing north, not packing, not alerting, just waiting." Dr. Okonkwo, a woman who did not believe in signs, allowed herself to exhale. Maya came off the operating table with a steady pulse and no arrhythmias. The denervation had been successful. She would need monitoring for the rest of her life, but the immediate threat was gone. When she woke, the first thing she asked was not about the scar on her chest or the tubes in her arms. She asked if Copper had been fed his carrots. She was discharged from the hospital 3 weeks later. The drive back to Kentucky was quiet, the landscape of Ohio and West Virginia sliding past windows streaked with spring rain. Tom drove slowly, carefully, as if the fragility of the past months had taught him that speed was an illusion. Lena sat in the back with Maya, who pressed her face to the glass and watched for the first signs of home. When they turned onto the gravel drive, Copper was already at the fence. He had been standing there since dawn, according to James, who had sat with him through the night. The horse lifted his head at the sound of the truck and let out a sound that was not a scream this time but something softer, a low, throaty nicker that seemed to carry every hour of waiting inside it. Maya ran to him before the truck had fully stopped, her small body still fragile from surgery, and pressed her forehead against his. Copper closed his eyes. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he exhaled, a deep breath that ruffled her hair, and the tension of 2 years of loss and fear and near death dissolved into the warm Kentucky air. The story should have ended there, with a child and her horse reunited, with a family made whole, with a villain in handcuffs and a community vindicated. And for most people who followed the news, it did end there. The headlines moved on. The donations were redirected to other causes. The cameras packed up and left the farm. But there was one final piece that no one saw coming, and it arrived in a plain white envelope 6 months later, addressed to Maya in careful cursive handwriting. The letter was from Patricia Voss. She had written it from federal prison, where she was serving an 8-year sentence, and she had spent 4 months composing words that clearly cost her something to put on paper. She did not ask for forgiveness. Instead, she asked a question that no one had thought to investigate. She had learned about Copper's abilities from a research paper published 9 years earlier, before Shepherd's Rest had even acquired him. That paper had been based on an earlier cohort of horses trained at a now-defunct facility in Montana. And among the researchers listed on that paper, buried in the acknowledgements, was a name that made Tom's blood run cold when he read it aloud: Dr. Margaret Harmon. The local vet who had scanned Copper's microchip, who had called Dr. Okonkwo, who had been the quiet force behind every medical decision that saved Maya's life, had known what Copper was from the very first day she examined him. She had read his microchip, recognized the registry number, and called Shepherd's Rest before she ever suggested it to the family. Angela had known who had Copper for months. The entire rescue had been a slow, careful orchestration designed to keep the horse where he could do the most good while the legal machinery ground toward a resolution that would not tear him from the child he had chosen. No one had lied to the family, but no one had told them the full truth either. When confronted, Dr. Harmon did not apologize. She sat on the porch of the farmhouse with a cup of coffee that Lena had poured for her despite everything, and she said the words that would stay with the family long after the anger faded. I knew what he was the moment I saw him. I also knew that if I told you, the board would have claimed him immediately, and Maya would have lost him before he ever had a chance to save her. I made a choice. I would make it again. There was no moral to unpack, no tidy lesson. Just a series of decisions made by people who loved a child and a horse in ways that the law could not measure. Maya, for her part, never understood the adult complexities of the story. She only knew that Copper had been there when she needed him, and that he was still there now, grazing in the pasture, pressing his head against her chest every morning as if to confirm that her heart was still beating steady. And it was. And it was. The story of Maya and Copper spread far beyond Kentucky in the years that followed. Researchers built entire studies around his ability to detect cardiac events before any machine could. Children with CPVT were paired with other medical alert animals, a program that Shepherd's Rest expanded using the protocols Copper had helped develop. Tom's defibrillator never fired, but he kept it anyway, a small reminder beneath his collarbone that he had been given time he was never supposed to have. Maya grew up. She went to school, made friends, learned to ride a horse who would let no one else on his back. She still has the scar on her chest, a thin white line that she traces absently when she talks about the birthday she turned 7. She does not remember the doll she never bought. She remembers the coins in her hand, the weight of them, and the way Copper lowered his head when she held them out, as if he understood exactly what they meant. The broader question, the one that lingers long after the cameras leave and the donations stop, is simpler than anyone wants to admit. How many other lives are walking around with undiagnosed catastrophes waiting to strike? And how many animals with extraordinary gifts are being discarded before they can intervene? Copper was hours from a slaughterhouse in Mexico. His training, his sensitivity, his ability to smell death before it arrived meant nothing to the system that had already priced him as meat. And if a 7-year-old girl with $28 in a cloth pouch had not insisted on saving him, 2 people would be dead, a rare genetic condition would have gone unstudied, and a therapy center would have lost the most valuable asset it never knew it had. The math does not add up because it is not supposed to. The equation runs backward. $28 bought a life, then another life, then a legacy of research that will save hundreds more. No economist can model that. No insurance policy covers it. It is the kind of return that only happens when someone stops looking at the price tag and starts paying attention to the eyes of a creature the world has already written off. Maya still brings him carrots every morning. He still presses his head against her chest, and she still stands still for it because she knows what he is listening for, and she knows he will catch it before anyone else does. She is 17 now, planning to study veterinary medicine, and Copper is 34, ancient for a horse, his muzzle gray, his gait slow. But his ears still prick forward when he hears her footsteps on the gravel, and that is enough. Before you go, if this story moved you the way it moved everyone who witnessed it firsthand, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that small choices can rearrange fate. And if you have ever been saved by an animal who had no reason to love you but chose to anyway, tell us in the comments. We read every single one.